G'day viewers, my name's Oren Thomas and today I am joined with my fellow cloud advocate Sonia Cuff and we're going to talk about intro to app and infrastructure migration and modernization through Azure. G'day Sonia.
Hey Oren, thanks. Great topic, let's chat.
Awesome. Okay, so the agenda for today is that we're going to talk about migration and modernization triggers, and we'll kind of break apart what the two of those different terms mean. We'll talk about how you figure out which apps and which infrastructure to modernize and migrate, how you choose the right migration strategy and modernization strategy, and modernizing processes and how DevOps might fit into all of that. Okay, so before we talk about cloud migration triggers, let's talk about the difference between migration and modernization. Sonia, what's your definition of migration?
So with a migration, you aren't changing the workload that much. With a cloud migration, you're looking at a fairly easy process to keep the workload that you're running intact and being able to, that lift and shift up into the cloud to carry on using it fairly much in its current state.
Okay, and modernization, as we'll get to a little later, is where you're actually updating your code or updating your app and probably making it run so it's designed to run in the cloud. And they're not exclusive. Sometimes you're going to migrate and then modernize, and in other cases, you're going to just modernize. So what we've got on this slide here is we've got a bunch of cloud migration triggers. We've got data center contract expiry. We've got business continuity. We've got cash flow challenges. We've got cybersecurity threats, rapidly scaling web apps and infrastructure, and budget and resource constraints. One of the ones that's not on here that's one of my favorite, one of the reasons that some organizations move to the clouds is foreign data centers. There's one particular organization that Microsoft's worked with who needed to expand globally. And rather than sort of go out and worry about signing contracts in foreign countries for data centers and then trying to figure out support, if you're in, say, Wagga, which is in outback New South Wales, and you decide to sort of rent some data center capacity in Paris, you're probably worried if your hard drive goes at 2 in the morning on a Saturday, who you'd actually call. If you're in the cloud, you don't have to worry about that because that's all looked after by, in our case, Microsoft. Which of these do you like, Sonia?
So Oren, I just want to pick up on the fact that you've got cybersecurity threats there in the slide. And it's interesting because to have that as a trigger for moving to the cloud sometimes confuses people, because we went through this whole argument about is the cloud secure and hesitations over trusting a provider to manage all the security around the infrastructure that I don't get to touch and feel and hold anymore. What we're finding, though, is that there is a significant investment by cloud providers to protect those cloud environments. And so it's not so much the fact that someone can't come in and steal the server that's sitting under the receptionist's desk. It's the fact that moving those signals and that environment outside of just your firewall and into the cloud provider's environment means that you've got the power of that cloud provider to help protect it. And just let me throw some quick numbers in here at you. Microsoft analyzes approximately 6.5 trillion signals into their environment every single day. So that's the scale that we're looking at and analysing security threats against environments at. We spend about $1 billion annually on security, and we've got over 3,500 full-time dedicated staff dedicated to security. So you're inheriting all the benefits of that security team that you don't necessarily have guarding your on-prem environment.
One of the other things that I really like about security in the cloud is something that I'm actually researching as sort of a part-time doctorate at the moment, which is compliance and security compliance. More and more organizations that are running their workloads need to be compliant with a particular set of security baselines. Might be ISO 27001, it might be the Cloud Security Alliance Cloud Control Matrix. And that can be really complicated to figure out whether or not you've got the right settings in your workloads to ensure that you are compliant. One of the things that the cloud security tools that are available in Azure do is they'll actually tell you which settings you need to turn on, to become actually compliant with a whole lot of regulatory benchmarks, something that otherwise would cost you a whole lot of money. Okay, so let's look now at modernization triggers. And here we've got, again, some of the same things drive modernization and migration, and some of them are completely different. Data center contracts expiring, delivering applications and features faster, urgent capacity needs, a software or a hardware refresh, addressing security threats, compliance, enabling new business opportunities, and software end of support. So we know, for example, that a lot of people out there are still running even Windows Server 2003 and SQL 2005, and they shouldn't be doing that. And that is a modernization trigger because those things are way out of compliance. They're no longer supported. And someone needs to do something about that application. And you just can't pick up a VM running Server 2003 and drop it into the cloud because that's not in any way supported. Windows Server 2008 is only supported under very specific sort of circumstances in the cloud. So that's a trigger for modernizing your app. Sonia, what do you like, or what interests you with modernization triggers?
Yeah, look, that software end of support one is very interesting because it does force people to go out and look at their options, right? Am I still going to stay with the same piece of software? Am I going to look at an alternative? Am I going to upgrade or replace this code base and maybe put in some new features and take advantage of some new functionality while we're there? An interesting thing that I've seen with modernization is a business that has a piece of software that it provides to customers. And so this isn't just relevant to people that run applications in-house. This is a vendor that makes a line of business application, and they were selling it to people to install on-prem. Then they moved to a kind of a cloud model where they were spinning up VMs per customer, and they were managing these different environments in the cloud for each different customer. And that was kind of an interim step to them going, well, hang on a minute, how else can we re-architect this application so that we can stand it up in these separate environments for these customers without the overhead of having to manage Windows Server and the whole virtual machine infrastructure? So there certainly is that was a combination of the software end of support and taking advantage of new business opportunities and how they can serve their customers and deliver them now their own, in essence, software as a service experience.
Okay, so there is a lot of different ways that you can choose to migrate or modernize. So, for example, when we're talking about migrating and modernizing, you can just do a rehost, which is, another way of saying lift and shift. You can refactor an application. You can re-architect an application, and they sort of sit under the broad category of IT-oriented triggers, and that's migration. You've also got the option of just going completely cloud native. You might have an application on-prem, and rather than trying to take that existing code base and do something with it, you might throw the whole baby out with the bathwater and decide to actually start rewriting an application from scratch. Or you've got application-oriented triggers, and that might be, as we talked about, we might have an end of support, or it might be that you've got an on-prem version of an app, and you take that on-prem version of an app and then you migrate to a software as a service version of an app. Can you think of some examples of that, Sonia?
That's a really good point, and we'll get into some details about how Microsoft has handled this across their portfolio too. But I think it's also interesting to realize that it's not just one choice here. You've got a whole application portfolio that you're responsible for doing, and so you can mix and match within these different models. It's not just that you have to move everything to the cloud in the one kind of method. You might choose to lift and shift some stuff, or rehost and refactor some stuff, replace with cloud native applications and put some of your stuff in software as a service. So it really does depend on that individual use case for that workload in your organization.
Okay, so common modernization and migration projects include Windows Server, SQL, Linux and open source databases, dev test environments, web apps, SAP, specialized workloads, and VDI. And one of the ones I like in this is dev test. We were talking to a great mate of ours, Ben Armstrong, who works on Azure Stack HCI and Kubernetes. And he was telling us about a particular scenario where a customer that he worked with was actually using the cloud with Kubernetes as a test environment for their Kubernetes clusters, but they were actually then deploying on-prem in an Azure Stack HCI instance because the application needed to be really close to the particular thing that it was interacting with. So there are more and more uses for the cloud where migrating to the cloud doesn't necessarily mean replacing everything that you've got on-prem. It might mean that you move certain things out to the cloud because they really, really work well there. And there's other stuff where you might keep it on-prem, or you might use the pipeline instead of the pipeline being dev here, run there. It might be dev there, run here. What's one of those workloads that you're really interested about, Sonia?
Yeah, look, I remember having to physically go into a room where the dev test lab was because we were working on projects that needed to be physically isolated from the network, from being anywhere near our production workloads. And so that absolutely makes sense to move to the cloud because I don't want to have to stand up hardware to provide that kind of environment and then have it sitting around when that proof of concept is done. It's also interesting to see that we have these specialized workloads and SAP specifically called out here. And so there's kind of a tipping point where those heavy workloads, you don't want to just try and spin up a standard Azure virtual machine to host some of those. And Microsoft has offerings like AVS, our VMware solution, and other things for NetApp and Oracle and SAP that are dedicated and fine-tuned to be effective and efficient and support those really grunty workloads. And we also mentioned VDI at the end very quickly. So this virtual desktop infrastructure, because the amount of times that I would spend babysitting my Windows terminal servers just to make sure that the performance kept up, right? Virtual desktop management is just a race to make sure that you've always got capacity and performance for those sessions that are logging in. And so to be able to move all of that to the cloud and have that easily scale to demand, it's really going to free up some time.
Look, absolutely. As someone who has dealt with some of those workloads on-prem, I know that when you're speccing out a server, like back in the days when we used to spec out physical hardware for a particular workload, it could be an absolute nightmare figuring out whether or not a particular hardware configuration was in the support matrix for that particular workload. When we're running these systems, these authorized systems where we're as Microsoft talking to the vendor that creates that, we already have all of those I's dotted and T's crossed as to whether or not that particular configuration is fully supported. Okay, so the big step, once you've decided we're going to the cloud, the next thing that you need to think about is doing what's called an application portfolio assessment. And that's a really fancy way of deciding, okay, what have we got? Can we move it? And what do we need to do? Now, this isn't new to anybody who's been in IT for a while. In fact, if you remember back to the days when we had Windows Vista or Windows 7 came out, we had all of these applications that were sitting there running on Windows 98 or Windows XP, where the applications were designed to run with admin privileges. But if you were trying to run them on Vista or 7, they weren't going to run. So you had to perform an assessment of your application portfolio to determine which of these applications were actually migration blockers. Sonia, what's your experience with application portfolio assessment?
It's really not a one-size-fits-all approach because your environment and how you use technology is unique to your business. But I love the fact that the assess and prioritize pillars of this assessment specifically call out getting the business involved. Now, I don't know what the role is of the people who are watching this session, whether or not we actually have the business stakeholders and that side of the organization rather than just our IT folks. But it's really important to make sure when we're doing this portfolio assessment, it's not just about the technical capabilities of the application. It's about what impact is this going to have on the business if it's not replaced, or what impact is it going to have on the business if we have to go through a process to move it or modernize it. And then the timing for when you actually make those changes also need to take into account what's going on with the business. So, working in the banking industry, we used to have a change freeze over the holiday period. It was one of the busiest times for banks. You don't want to be doing anything with applications then, not because IT can't do it, but because it's a really bad time for the business to be impacted. So you need to make sure that you get that input into your planning and you get the support from your business stakeholders, because that's going to make the difference between them thinking it was a successful project and just screaming about what a nightmare it was.
And one of the things that, you know, you and I have bled a bit over some migrations in our professional history, one of the things that we've certainly learned is that you start off small and you always assume a couple of things are going to go wrong. So you start off with some applications that seem fairly easy, and then you migrate them. What you don't do is you don't decide to eat the whole elephant at once and say, you know what, in 6 months, everything that's going to be here is going to be over there. Instead, start small and then slowly move your way through the process. Assume that there's going to be roadblocks, remediate the roadblocks, learn from what you've done, and then use what you've learned to keep moving on. Okay, so one of the first things that we talk about in terms of modernization is something that you can do already on-prem, and that is refactoring with container technology. So all refactoring with container technology is taking an application that might be running on your Windows servers or your Linux hosts and containerizing that application. And one of the good things about refactoring with container technology is there's already a whole lot of tools out there that actually allow you to automate this process. In fact, I even believe, if I was watching the news correctly, that there might be some tools that are built into Windows Server 2022 that assist with this process. So what you do is you, instead of running a VM, you're actually moving the application into a container. And the really cool thing about moving an application into a container is all of the dependencies for that application are sitting in that container, and you're not worrying about, for example, from the IT pro perspective, making sure all those dependencies are actually present on the application. Now, the advantage with that is that you can move to a pipeline where the developer actually is able to develop the application on their laptop. It's all sitting in a container. They just hand the container off to you or put it into a registry. You can pull that container down and run it on your local servers, or you can push it up into a registry that's available in the cloud and run it over there. You can put it in Azure Container Registry. Now, the other really cool thing with containers is the whole container orchestration story, which allows you to basically run that application at scale. Instead of spinning up VM after VM after VM after VM after VM, when load increases, you just throw it at the container orchestrator and allow that to handle it. Now, re-architecting with microservices is a matter of taking an existing app that might be running on a VM, and all of the components of that application are one monolithic bit of code. And you will know, if you've ever looked after certain apps, that some apps run terribly. And the reason that they run terribly is that there's this one little bit of code that hasn't been optimized and it hasn't been fixed and it doesn't work really well. But the only way to get the whole app running really fast is to basically throw more CPUs at the whole VM and kind of hope that the whole thing's going to work. Or it might be using a ton of RAM. So you just got to keep stacking it on. What you do with microservices is you pull the whole thing apart, and then you have each sort of almost like a bit of execution. And what you can do is then throw resources at those little bits of execution as you need. If there's a bottleneck, you can throw more cores at the thing that's the bottleneck without having to throw heaps more cores at the whole application. Sonia, you've had some thoughts about re-architecting with microservices and a particularly famous book.
Absolutely. Look, this always makes me think of the Phoenix project. And while the Phoenix project is talking about DevOps processes, and we'll get to that in a minute, it really is about taking that view of looking down on your application like it is a processing warehouse, like a manufacturing plant. If you've got a bottleneck in one part of that manufacturing plant, you can fix and improve all the other bits all you like, but you're not going to get a better end-to-end process when you've got this one bottleneck in the one spot. Microservices means that it's easier to be able to identify and fix those bottlenecks, but it also means that you can decide to go and buy the latest fandangled machine and plug it into one one spot to try and test and see if it makes an improvement without having to, as you said, update the whole application and roll out a whole new major version.
Okay, so the next thing that we wanted to talk about was Microsoft's own particular experience or journey to the cloud. Now, at Microsoft, we've got this sort of a philosophy of dog fooding. That is that we should eat it, we should use it before we sort of go and hand it off to customers. And that before we start telling everybody else that they need to modernize, they need to migrate, they need to move all of their stuff to the cloud, well, we're a pretty big company. You know, we're worth more than $1 trillion on the stock market, and we've got a lot of people. So what are the pain points? And what we did is we really went in and documented our own journey to the cloud. Sonia, what were some of the things that Microsoft learned in its own journey to the cloud?
I'm always nervous about talking about stories about how Microsoft did it, right? Because people expect we're a big tech company. We should be good at doing this stuff. And yet when you have a look at these statistics, I don't think they're too different than what a lot of our customers would find when you're doing their own application portfolio assessments. The interesting thing is when you start to add these numbers up and look at them, about 30% of those applications we could retire, right size or eliminate altogether. And then about 15% we could get the same functionality by either using a new software as a service solution or using functionality in a SaaS or a PaaS solution that we already had. And then down the bottom, we've got about 5% of these applications that we were just going to leave on-prem. And so add those up, and we've already tackled about 50% of over 3,500 applications. That only leaves us 50% now to deal with, and that split of about 15% of IaaS being able to move or optimize and move those to infrastructure as a service meant that we were only left with 35% out of our portfolio that we looked at moving to platform as a service type features. So the numbers are really interesting. It would be great to compare with some of our other customers, but I don't think it's too far off in terms of what we found and how we approached it. That 30% number though, to find out that about that much of the applications we weren't actually using anymore, it's actually not very surprising for any organization.
No, it's not. There's a stat out there, I think it was Gartner pulled it, that about 30% of virtual machine workloads sitting in data centers are what they call comatose. That is that someone spun it up and it's no longer being used. And this number we keep coming back to. It's almost like a Pareto distribution, which is the old 80-20 rule, that 20% of things, and then there's an 80% of things, and there's always this weird ratio that just keeps turning up again and again and again. So we're seeing that, and I remember again back in the days with sort of client migrations, where I was talking to a particular company and they had 5 applications that simply worked on XP, that the vendor had gone bust, and they were paranoid about moving to Windows 7 because they went, well, we've got these 5 applications. And then some bright spark in the Sydney office said, well, can we track how many people actually use these applications? And at no point in the assessment had anybody actually gone and seen how often is this being used. So when they tracked it, they found that 4 of the applications that had been holding up this entire organization's migration to Windows 7 actually hadn't been used by anybody for a couple of years. And then there was one person that was using that one application, and they were able to come up with a solution for that particular individual. So you would be amazed when you are doing this migration and modernization journey. You really need to know what's your organization doing. And that's another advantage of moving to the cloud, because when you've got everything in the cloud, you can suddenly light up all your infrastructure. And it's not that sort of old Novell server that's sitting behind the brick wall that nobody knows where it is and it hasn't been rebooted for 12 years. Well, you're very much aware of all of your workloads because you're tracking them and hopefully making sure that they're tagged. And tags are really great because they help you identify who owns what, and you can force people to tag workloads before they deploy them. Okay, so one of the other things that moving to the cloud really enables, and it's not that you're blocked from doing this on-prem, it's just that the way that the cloud is structured allows you to do this a lot better, is this idea of a DevOps type workflow. And all that means is continuous deployment, continuous improvement, that you can take something and continuously iterate on it in a way that is a lot more difficult when you've got a fixed set of infrastructure on-prem. Now, on the other side of it, and there's a lot of IT pros that hear the word DevOps and they go, again, but why they do that is they live in environments where they're buying off-the-shelf software and there's no DevOps processes. So it can work for some and not work for others. But one of the things that's really great about it in Azure, for example, with deployment of stuff, is everything can be templated. So you can quickly deploy from a template in Azure a lot easier than you can on-prem. You can certainly do it, for example, through System Center Virtual Machine Manager, but with Azure, everything can be templated. Okay, so one of the last things that we want to talk about is the cloud adoption framework. And we do have a colleague who is giving a session on this in the next 24 hours. So if you're interested, check out Sarah Lean's session on this. But Sonia, tell us a bit more about the cloud adoption framework.
So we've talked a lot about all the different decisions that you need to make when you're looking at migrating to the cloud. And the cloud adoption framework really does give you the tools and the processes to go ahead and do that. It steps you through different parts of the decision-making process and the assessment process. And there are tools and templates that are available for you to download to capture that decision-making process as well. One of the things I like about the cloud adoption framework is that it's not just about doing this process once of trying to plan what you're moving to the cloud first, for example, and then how you will adopt those cloud benefits. But it's also about governing and managing those workloads, because that's something that you're going to do over and over again, right? As your use of these workloads increases and time goes on, you need to make sure that these workloads are still performing and they're secured and they're compliant. And so setting up the foundation now by stepping through the cloud adoption framework helps you to make good decisions about using things like Azure policy and tagging, so that when later on down the road you're trying to enforce standards or find workload owners or whatever it is, you've got those foundations in place now and you'll keep coming back and using them and then updating them as your needs change.
Okay, so we are drawing towards the end of this particular session. In this session, we've talked about migration and modernization triggers and what the difference between migration and modernization is. We've talked about application portfolio assessments and how that you can go and look at, or that you really need to have a good detailed look at what's going on with your applications and your infrastructure and figuring out how you actually go and migrate and modernize. You can choose the right migration strategy. So what is the right way to do it? Is it lift and shift? Is it lift and shift? And one of the important things to reiterate that we talked about right at the start of the session about this is that when you lift up a VM to the cloud, in the back of your mind should be, at some point, I need to modernize the application, because running a VM can be a bit expensive. Pardon me. Instead, you should be thinking about, how do I get that application out of the VM? Sorry, I'm dying on stage. Or modernizing processes, or using DevOps. And whether or not you actually want to jump in and start using DevOps processes if you're an organization that actually has a whole lot of developers on staff. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to push you towards aka.ms Learn at Ignite, because this particular session is actually tied in to a learning path, or actually a module that's on MS Learn. If you've got any questions that you want to come up with now or come up with later, you can at us on Twitter at Sonia Cuff or at Oren Thomas, and we would be more than thrilled to answer those questions and point you in the appropriate direction where you could get answers. Sonia, do you have anything to say?
Look, I don't. It's a big step. Don't think you had to do it all at once. Take your time and figure out those workloads that are going to be important to you to prioritize first. And yeah, I think that's my sort of key takeaway for this session.
Okay, this session will be available on demand later, which is really great for you that are watching it now. And if you're not watching it now, well, you're already watching it on demand, aren't you? Anyway, look, have a wonderful Ignite, and Sonia and I will see you later.